On January 23, 1957, Princess Caroline of Monaco entered the world not in a hospital, but within the prince's palace itself, a distinction that marked her significance from her first breath. She was born into ceremony rather than joy, duty rather than freedom. The timing of her arrival, documented to the minute by court physicians, was more than a medical formality. It was a constitutional event. Across Europe, newspapers didn't simply announce her birth as a royal infant. They printed legal commentary alongside photographs explaining what her existence meant for Monaco's independence and political future. Monaco in 1957 was a tiny principality of only 2 square kilometers with roughly 18,000 inhabitants. Under the 1918 Frankmanist Treaty, if the principality had no clear heir, France could absorb it entirely. Caroline's arrival solved that problem, at least for a moment. She was registered immediately as hereditary princess, her life forever tied to the survival of a nation before she could even open her eyes to understand light. Yet, this certainty came with an inherent fragility. Caroline was not heir absolute, but heir presumptive, a distinction that would haunt her childhood. Under Monaco's succession laws at the time, a younger brother would outrank an older sister. Every tutor, courtier, and palace official looked at her through this lens of uncertainty. She was the kingdom's guarantee unless a boy arrived to change everything. Caroline's mother was Grace Kelly, one of Hollywood's brightest stars. With an Oscar, major film roles, and a career worth nearly $1 million per picture in today's money, Grace had given up everything to become Princess of Monaco. Her sacrifice was total and, according to those who knew her, deeply mourned in private. When Caroline was born, Grace had already stopped acting. She smiled for cameras, stood beside her husband at ceremonies, and looked perfect in public. But palace friends later said she sometimes watched her old films in the palace cinema, not to revisit memories, but to remember who she had once been. Around Caroline, she was no longer Grace Kelly, the actress. She was Her Serene Highness, bound by formality, duty, and appearance. Caroline's father, Prince Rainier III, brought a different kind of pressure into the household. He had taken the throne in 1949 at just 25 and ran Monaco with the focus of a businessman building an empire. He pushed tourism, expanded hotels, strengthened casinos, and turned the principality into a luxury destination for the rich. His days were consumed by meetings, public appearances, and endless planning. Staff described the palace as a place where work came before warmth. Even inside the walls, life felt more official than personal. The emotional distance was profound. Caroline's earliest memories were not of being cuddled or soothed, but of being arranged, presented, and watched. Palace etiquette required children to dine separately from their parents until they were old enough to behave properly at the formal table. For Caroline, that separation lasted until she was 14. While diplomats and designers sat with her parents in glittering rooms, she sat with silver cutlery laid out perfectly, surrounded by service but not warmth. In a palace full of people, she felt profoundly alone. The one person who provided genuine comfort was her nanny, Moran Marin Wood. When Moran went on vacation, both Caroline and her younger brother, Albert, born in 1958, cried so desperately that Grace had to call her back early. In a home filled with titles and formality, the nanny became the emotional center of their early lives. On March 14, 1958, Caroline's world changed irrevocably. Her younger brother Albert was born, male, and under Monaco's succession rules, that meant everything. The moment he entered the line of succession, he moved ahead of her. Caroline went from being the kingdom's guarantee to being second place before she could even say mother or father. The same palace system that had treated her as the nation's future now quietly shifted that expectation onto Albert. That early loss set the tone for much of her life. Duty stayed, pressure stayed, but certainty did not. She was still royal, still visible, still important, but no longer central in the same way. As she got older, that loss sharpened, becoming the defining lens through which she saw herself and her role. Caroline would later summarize her childhood with a simple sentence that contained everything. What I had to do always came before what I wanted to do. It was not just a personal feeling. It was the system she had been born into. Her father wanted disciplined children ready for royal life, not free spirits. From age 5 or 6, Caroline's days filled with protocol, appearances, rules, and endless expectations. Even the smallest choices, what to wear, which friends to see, how to behave, were filtered through one question: what looks right for Monaco? Caroline's escape from the palace came through schools. She attended St. Mary's in Escute, then Sciences Po in Paris, then the Sorbonne, where she studied philosophy, psychology, and biology. On paper, it looked impressive, and she was bright, disciplined, and academically strong, earning her French baccalaureate with high honors and excelling particularly in philosophy. But beneath the achievement lay a harder truth. She spent much of her youth away from home. Her father believed this path would make her serious and prepared. But it also meant that some of her most important years were spent in formal classrooms and boarding school rooms instead of inside a warm family life. By the time she finished her studies, she had become highly educated, highly polished, and emotionally trained to function. But that did not mean she felt rooted. By the late 1970s, Caroline became a star of a different kind. She was no longer just the royal daughter hidden behind palace walls. She was one of the most photographed young women in Europe. Magazine covers multiplied. Paparazzi followed her across Paris. Fashion houses wanted her in their clothes. Every outing became a story. Every expression became material. The girl raised inside duty had become a symbol of glamour, whether she wanted that role or not. She enrolled at Sciences Po in Paris, but quickly discovered that the world was far more interested in where she went at night than in what she read during the day. She became a regular in the city's nightlife, especially at places like Rhenus, where she could dance until early morning and feel, at least for a few hours, less like a princess and more like a young woman trying to breathe. The problem was that nothing stayed private. If she went to one gala, cameras followed. If she went to 4 events in a week, the press turned it into a personality. Her social life swallowed her academic achievements in the public imagination. Teachers praised her work, and she had real ability, but the press barely cared. They mentioned her grades briefly before rushing back to nightclub photos and rumors. Over time, that mismatch turned her into a public contradiction. Intelligent, educated, and thoughtful, but flattened by the world into the image of a party princess. The palace tried to control that image, and in doing so drove her further away. The harder they tried to shape her into something polished and manageable, the more she pushed back. She skipped engagements and made private choices more publicly visible, and every act of rebellion only fed the cameras more. Caroline was 21 when she married Philippe Junot in 1978. He was 38, 17 years older, a French businessman with a reputation for nightlife, charm, and instability. Her parents feared him immediately. They saw not a solid partner, but risk, embarrassment, and trouble moving toward their daughter with a smile. The wedding was a grand royal spectacle with photographers everywhere and famous guests. But behind the glitter, the family mood was dark. Grace, according to later accounts, was deeply distressed and did not believe the marriage would last. That dread proved prophetic. Most painfully, Junot reportedly brought a photographer friend during the honeymoon, and private images of Caroline soon found their way into tabloids. For Caroline, who had spent her whole life being watched, the betrayal cut deeply. Even intimacy could be sold. By October 1980, just over 2 years after the wedding, they were divorced. Caroline was only 23. The civil marriage ended, but the church did not grant an annulment for many years, leaving her in a painful in-between space. The legal split was clean. The emotional aftermath was not. When Caroline met Stefano Casaraghi, her life was full of cracks. Her mother had died in a tragic car crash in September 1982, a loss that still hung over everything. She was also carrying the pain of her failed marriage. Stefano, an Italian businessman, was coming out of heartbreak himself after ending an engagement. They met at Jimmy's Disco in Monaco in spring 1983, and people around Caroline quickly noticed something different about Stefano. So many men had been drawn to her title or the glamour that followed her. Stefano did not seem interested in any of that. He treated her like a woman, not a prize. He was 23, handsome, confident, and warm in a way that made Caroline feel safe. He took her to his family's chateau in Genoa, where she met his parents and experienced a world built on business and real estate rather than ceremony and politics. For Caroline, who had grown up inside duty and pressure, this felt like fresh air. By the end of 1983, they were married in a simple civil ceremony at Monaco's Princess Palace. Caroline wore a short beige cream silk satin